Let's take a listen to what we've set up here with THU. We're coming in with a fairly low signal into THU. This will simply have the effect of not driving the amp as hard, so for the time being we will retain a very clean bass sound. We're also using the Slate Bass Classic, so I'll go through the settings for that now. Whenever I'm dealing with a DI bass, I do like to use this type of setup where what we have is we have the splitter. On one side of that splitter, we are processing the DI with an amplifier, and on the other side, with the parallel channel, we're just using a basic EQ so that we can have control over the dry DI sound. This is really helpful for when you are dealing with more crazy bass effects. So, say for instance, you're mixing a track for a hard rock style, and what you want is a very edgy bass. Well, what you might want to do is you might want to go in, get some of that nice amp tonality first, but then use the really pristine top end of the DI'd bass to bring in a sense of edginess to the overall tonality. Now, in this example, we're blending the two and we're not actually doing anything with the EQ. Here, I wanted to mention the importance of checking the phase, because what we're essentially doing is duplicating the sound and then processing those two sounds in parallel and modulating them to be slightly different to one another, and then you're bringing those two back together. It's very important to check the phase, especially with any instrument which has a lot of bass, because the waveforms in the low end are much longer and you can accidentally lose all of the bass information if you have phasing issues. Now take a listen to what happens when I flip the polarity when we blend these two basses back together. So it's absolutely night and day. You can hear it was crying out for the polarity to be switched. It's just something to be aware of when you're using this type of technique in your mixes. And this is the area where we can blend between the DI and the amp sound. So basically when the fader is down, you get more DI, and when it is up, you get more amp sound. For this mix, I left it in the middle, but as you'll hear soon, in this example, it didn't really matter how I blended the two. I just wanted to share this method of having good control over your amp and DI blend, because it can be really helpful in other scenarios. For instance, like the making an edgy bass sound example that I gave you earlier. Now this EQ is kind of why it didn't matter too much what I did with the blend between the DI and the bass. What we're about to do is we're going to completely take away all of the top end of our bass and only leave the lows, which will help the bass anchor in our mix. We could have just done this with the DI, but the amp will add some subtle thickening which will help, and also the impulse response will give us a nice tonal shaping in the lows. So why are we taking away the top end of our bass? Well, firstly, for this mix type, it wasn't important. Now, a lot of rock and metal mixes will like that detail in the top end, but for this instance, we have the attack of the strums, the bow sound of the violin, so adding the attack of the bass plucks into this would have probably been too much and also wouldn't have suited stylistically. There is another reason. To get the bass really present and anchored in the lows, we have a little trick we're going to use in a moment, but first, before I show you that, let's take a listen to what this EQ is doing. As you can hear, all of that top end spikiness is gone now, and all we have left are those rounded lows. Now, one problem that we have is that with the sound being so simplified, anyone playing this on small speakers will either lose a lot of presence of the bass or completely lose all of the bass, which brings me to the next few steps.